Thank you. It's great to be here. Foundational is a code word for old. And I'm happy to embrace it, along with some of my other foundational colleagues here in the room. So the topic and the question of why does after school matter from a positive youth development perspective, if you're one of those foundational folks in the room, you'll remember that before after-school programs, we talked about out-of-school programs. Before out-of-school, we talked about community programs. And community programs were really at some point grappling with whether they were just in place to prevent problems from happening, or they actually were really embracing a broader vision of actually being supportive in preparation and engagement. And so what I decided to do with the 15-plus minutes that I have with you today is literally give you a walk through the slides that I've used over the past 20, 30 years to figure out how we talk about the relationship between positive youth development and the places where positive youth development actually has always been practiced and flourished, which are those after-school, out-of-school community programs, and many programs that when they were handed funding from a prevention perspective had this intuitive sense that problem-free isn't fully prepared, and started to embrace that. So we go all the way back to my days at the Children's Defense Fund when we were looking at various programs to prevent violence, prevent delinquency, et cetera. That was the name of the game. What stood out were programs that were figuring out how to take those dollars and take those young people who clearly had those kinds of risks and challenges in their lives, but figure out how to do the things that you've already heard about consistency in relationships, et cetera. So this was one of the first slides that we started to use and started a language around really broadening the goal beyond prevention. And so I actually have a clock that someone made for me that says problem-free isn't fully prepared, that occasionally works hanging in my office. But this idea of really moving up from treatment to prevention to preparation, and then really fully embracing the idea that if we're doing this right, it's not just about better preparation, it's about full participation, and young people have to be fully engaged in order to get the full benefit of what we're offering them. And again, as Dru said, that's not just about in after school, it's in any setting where young people spend their time. The second tenet that really was sort of the positive youth development tenet as this language and approach started to take hold was really the idea of not only broadening the goals, but broadening the services and supports. How do we move beyond? And so as I said, when we started this work, it was very much a sense that you picked the problem you were working on. And so we developed over time this sort of donut approach, because when, again, we found, and this was before we were doing research on them, when you found programs that were effective, and now this has all been validated with Durlock and Weisberg and Dale Blythe's work and Bart's work, all this work has been now validated, but when in your gut you found programs like Cycle that were effective, it was because they were not just treating the problems, they were figuring out how to develop those core supports and opportunities that young people needed to have in order to be able to use whatever specific services you were providing around those problems. And often the core supports and opportunities were enough. Now, what we've seen over time is that even when you look at the federal government, and in the time that I was sort of briefly connected to the White House, we did a little analysis, and we've gone from youth development language being invisible in federal policy and state policy to it actually really being embraced and used. Not just the term youth development, but some of these broader goals of not just preventing problems, but making sure young people were civically engaged, that they were physically healthy and well. We were talking and will continue to talk about sort of vocational success and readiness, social emotional health and learning. All of these terms have made their way from practice into policy over years, and so we're beginning to get, the definitions are often still a little bit murky, but we're beginning to get policy and funding footholds that actually embrace the long-term goals of youth development, which again go beyond making sure that young people are not in trouble. The third tenet, which clearly, and again you can see I like to draw pictures, the third tenet of positive youth development really sort of brought in the idea that we have to broaden beyond school. again, this is old news now, whichever figure you use, young people spend somewhere between 17 and 27% of their time in that building that we call school. Where do they spend the rest of their time? But the basic idea, bringing to communities a visual that says, you can focus on school, and you can focus on improving schools, but if you don't know where young people are spending the rest of their time, you're not doing all that you can to promote youth development in a positive way. As Dru said, they're gonna learn from somebody. So if the only folks you're thinking about making sure that they're learning from are the folks that they see in that 17 to 25% of their time, you're really missing an opportunity. The other thing that we did very intentionally was to say, at that point, if we think about after school too narrowly, if you think about after school as a little box that you stick on to school that operates from 3 to 6 p.m. and has basically the same goals of sort of academic achievement and attainment stuck onto it, you're filling more of that space, but you're not filling all of the space that you could. So we're here now talking about the connection between positive youth development and after-school programs. And one of the things that after-school programs, when they are doing it well, what they do is they provide a formal connection to the rest of that space, because they're connecting to families, they're connecting to volunteers, they're connecting to folks in the community, they're getting those young people to go out and walk around and see and connect to who else is there. That doesn't mean that schools can't do that, but if we really keep in mind that essentially young people wake up in the morning and they look for places to go, people to talk to, and possibilities to explore, they are going to find those places and people and possibilities. They're either going to find them in very narrow and not productive ways, or we're going to help guide them. But we have to guide them through that full space. And so that idea of developmental space becomes important. And then Dale comes along and talks about developmental nutrients. One of the things that we have in positive youth development are a lot of analogies, because we really are talking about growth and development. We're talking about something that's organic. And so we don't tend to put up complicated flow charts. We really tend to look for ideas and visualizations that remind us that we are basically charged with supporting development, and development hinges on engagement. And so if we don't start with that, we don't get very far. It was a big deal for the youth development world in 2002 when folks like many of us in the room behind the scenes convinced the National Research Council that there was enough there that they could actually put together a commission. I was clearly too biased to be on the commission, but I got to stand outside and sort of put things under the door that they could look at. But I've never been terribly neutral in my approach to things. But creating the community programs to promote youth development was a big deal for us, because by 2002, we had the 40 assets, we had the 5 promises, we were beginning to just get a proliferation of pictures and language and alliterations that were helping us describe in our own programs and in our own research and in our own communities what we meant by positive youth development, but we were beginning to confuse everybody else and starting to confuse ourselves and compete with ourselves. And we really needed someone to both pull together the evidence base and someone to actually give us some official neutral language. That doesn't mean that we stopped using ours, but we really needed to both get the validation that what we were doing was important, and we needed some sort of neutral official language. So this was a big deal. And the first takeaway from this study, and again, you're going to see a lot of the folks, Reed Larson I don't think is in the room now, but no, Reed Larson is in the room. Hi, Reed. So you've got folks here who were really absolutely instrumental in sort of being the glue behind looking across research in settings where young people spend their time, after-school settings, school settings, even family settings in some extent, looking at what the evidence was. And so for me, one of the first takeaways with this was really validating that, reducing or preventing youth problems and promoting youth strengths are both important goals, that it's not an either or, that it really is both, and that when we do our work together, we have to really focus on both, and that we have to view problem reduction efforts in the context of youth development. The second set of takeaways really affirmed that while cognitive development is critical, not new here, There's a range of important developmental domains that are critical to adult success. And this is the list that the council put together: physical, intellectual, psychological, and emotional development, social development. Very important to get that validated. The third takeaway, and this is the one that I think really began to undergird what has now been 20 years of very good work, and you're going to hear more about it later on. My colleague Charles Smith is going to come up and talk on the panel. It's going to talk about quality. The idea that we really do know what a developmental setting looks like in terms of its characteristics, that regardless of the content being delivered, regardless of whether that setting is in a school, in a community organization, in a youth employment training center, young people need to have physical and psychological safety. They need to have appropriate structures. They need to have supportive relationships, opportunities to belong, positive social norms, support for efficacy and mattering, as you heard about just now, opportunities for skill building, especially skill building in things that interest them. And then that sort of last one is there's got to be integration of family, school, and community efforts. And for those of you who are old enough to remember Fritz Yanni's book, I think it was called A Search for Structure, the disconnect between moving between environments, if they're not really aligned, was also found to be harmful for kids. So, National Research Council was very important in giving us the language that we could all sort of hook back our 5 promises or 40 assets or whatever we were using to. Very important in validating that there really was a connection between prevention and promoting youth development, and that there really were things about the developmental efficiency of settings that we could measure independent of the content or the goals that we were trying to do with young people. The other study that came along in the same time that was equally critical for our being able to make the case about positive youth development was Jim Connell and Michelle Gamboa's study that really was a meta-analysis looking across several longitudinal studies of young people from early adolescence into their early 20s, doing threshold analysis, which we won't come back and talk about, to really figure out what matters. And what they found, sort of putting what young people need to do into 3 broad domains of they need to be productive, they need to be healthy, they need to be connective, defining developmentally appropriate definitions of those from early adolescence to young adulthood. But what they found was that when you looked at young people in those 3 domains and you sorted them, by young adulthood, only about 43% of young adults were doing well by a pretty basic definition of doing well. Doing well meant they were productive, which meant as a young adult they were either working or in school or in the military. They were healthy, that meant they had basic good health. They were not engaged in extremely risky behaviors, and they had healthy relationships that they reported, and they were connected to something bigger than themselves. They were connected to the faith community, they were volunteering, they were voting, they were doing something that got them outside of themselves. Those are pretty basic definitions, and they only had to be doing well in 2 of them, and then not doing okay in the 3rd. Even with that basic definition, only 4 out of 10 young adults were doing well. And we took this information around the country for probably about 4 years into all kinds of communities and asked, with that definition, how do you think your young people are doing? And we never found a community that said that their kids were doing better. And we often found communities that said, well, with that definition, I'm not even sure our kids would meet that definition. On the other hand, you had 2 out of 10 young people who were really in trouble. They were engaged in illegal activities, they were engaged in high-risk behaviors, they had dropped out of school, they were on welfare, et cetera. So what the Gamboa study did was it gave us a sobering way to engage folks in what I would now say is we can be kidding ourselves if we just look at things like high school graduation rates. They mask the fact that our young people from a development perspective are not doing well and are not ready for the things they want to be ready for. Really, really important research because it gave us that picture. Equally important research because of the meta-analysis, you were able to find that not only could we define that young people weren't doing very well by definitions that we thought made sense, you also found that if we provided those basic supports that the National Research Council said were important, young people did better. So what they found was that even starting in adolescence, starting with young people going into high school, those young people who throughout their high school years had supportive relationships, right? Supportive relationships with teachers, with youth workers, with peers, were 5 times, not 5%, 5 times more likely to leave high school ready than their peers who did not have supportive relationships. They found the same thing for challenging experiences and chances to contribute. Young people who had supportive relationships were 5 times more likely to come out ready. That's not 5 times more likely to graduate, but they graduated with a B- average or better. They graduated with a clear sense of where they wanted to be going next, and they were much more likely to get there. Because then in young adulthood, those young people who had supportive relationships and came out ready as seniors were 4 times more likely to be doing well. So that basic idea that if we provide those basic nutrients that the National Research Council identified, we can completely change the trajectory of where young people are going. Cycles can happen everywhere if we start to define what those nutrients are and provide them steadily to young people. So Gamboa's work allowed us to wrap around, literally, the core idea that we want young people to be academically and vocationally productive, the prevention ideas that young people need to be physically and emotionally healthy and safe, and we still have a very strong, especially from a policy and funding perspective, we have a very strong grounding in the fact that we give money when problems happen and we want to see problems reduced. That's not a bad thing. The challenge in where the PYD helped us was in filling in this empty space in between and saying if young people aren't socially and emotionally and civically connected, we don't get them academically and vocationally productive, and we don't do a good job of reducing risky behaviors either. So there's a twofer there. There's a synergy in being able to do that. Employers have validated the importance of these skills, and employers really find that 4 out of 10 young people are not ready for work even if they have a high school diploma. So you do those studies, which we've done with funding from Altria and other folks, and we find that employers tell us regularly, we don't often even look at high school diplomas anymore because so many young people show up with the credential but without the competencies that we need to have. So heading to the finish line. We certainly know, this is sort of moving forward in time, those of you in the room know that we really have, as a field, focused on and embraced the idea of social-emotional learning. Castle's definition of social-emotional learning, which is up there, is certainly one that has been embraced broadly. And again, the Durlock and Weisberg study, which showed that programs, after-school programs, that are safe, that are structured, sequential, active, focused, and explicit in the targeting and expectation that young people are going to master specific skills, programs that have those characteristics, that are high quality defined by those characteristics, got you improvements in all of these areas. Young people's relationship skills improved, their academic connections and competencies improved. All that happens when we provide a quality program. When we don't provide a quality program, you don't get those results. You may prevent problems, but you don't promote development. Again, in this field, a huge breakthrough that we then had another big meta-analysis that came along, which allowed us to say with confidence, quality matters. Getting personal at that point in time, because quality matters, the forum really began to work with youth development intermediaries who before were really bringing programs together to build those networks of after-school, out-of-school community programs to provide training and support and advocacy and fund development, and started to say we need to introduce this idea of quality. It's good enough to have the programs and to provide training, but we now have clear evidence that quality matters, and we now have very well-defined expectations and understandings of what quality means and what quality means in a content-neutral way. What quality means across programs. And you know when you bring after-school programs together, we're bringing together sports programs and mentoring and arts, we're going to have a variety of those programs later on. If we all try to measure quality based on the content that we provide, we get dozens and dozens of different examples. if we measure quality based on the core tenets of positive youth development and whether we're meeting those, we get one clear definition of what quality is. The forum went out, we looked around for the folks who were really doing quality and doing quality assessment and doing it from a continuous improvement way. We hooked up with Weichert, which is now actually a part of the forum, and you got this basic model, which for those of you who remember Psych 101 is essentially Maslow's needs hierarchy. Again, all of this is being reaffirmed. There's nothing new here because all we're doing is literally supporting development. But we've made huge, huge advances in the science behind what it takes to support development and the science behind quality improvement. So we really know we can do it. I'm going to steal a tiny bit of Charles's thunder in the last minute that I have and say this idea, where we are right now, and I think this is important for us to recognize. When we talk about after school and positive youth development, where we are right now is that lots of people are talking about various language, social, emotional skills. Whether it's grit, it's persistence, it's all of these things that there's a language. Again, we're going to need another NRC study to clean up the language for us. But we know that lots of folks are focusing on that and saying that's what we need young people to have. We need after-school programs as the places where those skills get practiced so that they can be transferred into other settings which are not as generous and hospitable. We do that by making sure in our programs we consistently engage young people because engagement is what gets skills built. We do that by having quality instruction, and we know now how to measure quality. So that then becomes the setting in which, and that's where, and I'm not going to go more because I'm both out of time, and Charles will talk about this, but really this idea of building quality to increase youth engagement so that we're actually getting skills as young people practice in our programs so that they then can transfer those skills into school, into work, into family situations. That's what this is really all about. So how does positive youth development fit into after school at this point in time? It fits in because basically after school programs continue to be the best place where young people can practice and build those readiness skills that are now being identified as critical by schools, by higher education in particular, by prevention programs have always known that young people need to build those skills, by workforce, pushed by employers, and increasingly by juvenile justice and child welfare. So we've got a lot of momentum that's focusing on we need young people to build those skills. And there's a really interesting role that we can play, not only as the places where young people can build those skills, but also as the people who know how to build those skills and increasingly can make our way into those other settings and teach folks how you create environments where young people can build skills. So last slide, again, why this matters is what I just said, because right now those other systems are being pushed. If they continue business as usual, they're not going to be able to be accountable for what they're now being held accountable for, right? So juvenile justice folks are now, they can't just be held accountable for holding kids together, they're now increasingly accountable for reducing recidivism. They can't reduce recidivism rates if they're not helping young people build the skills so that when they go back out, they don't get back into the same problems. This is happening over and over again, and that means that we have a chance to be both more important as settings where those skills are built and more important as trainers. This is just a quick example, which I won't even explain, that this is moving into schools. This is an example of a new Tech High report card in which naming those skills, and this is what we do in after school, is starting to happen in school, naming those skills becomes critically important because then young people get to see that it's not just about learning the content, but it's actually about learning and practicing the skills. Naming the skills also meant that it changed how teachers taught their classes. You'll see over the next couple months, we'll send it out to all of you. The official launch of something that we at the forum are calling the Regulus Project. This is where we'll go for the next 5 years. I think we have an opportunity to actually talk about the fact that in all of those settings, we may be graduating young people that have the right credentials, but they don't have the right competencies, that readiness is what we need to be aiming for, and that we've got folks who are talking about readiness gaps, employers, higher education, folks who are talking about we're not getting what we need from kids. We've got increased recognition that Some of the places where kids spend their times are actually readiness traps. Ask me that question when we get back on the panel. I'll give you a really powerful example from DC. And what we need to do right now is really start to better map what we mean by readiness. So seriously, I think we probably do need another NRC study to really take apart this huge language that we have about competencies and skills and assets and help us understand what it is that young people need to be ready and get them empowered to understand how they make their own path towards readiness. Thank you.